From our State House studio in Montgomery, I'm Todd Stacy. Welcome to Capitol Journal. Lawmakers are set to reconvene here in the capital city tomorrow for the 21st day of the legislative session. Counting tomorrow, they have 10 meeting days left this session. In case you're curious or need to plan, let's look at the likely scenarios. Under the Constitution, the legislature has 105 calendar days to meet for 30 legislative days. Now 10 to go, the House and Senate should see a mix of 2 and 3 day weeks through the end of May and into June. Most years, legislative leadership decides to take a 10-day break between the second to last day and last day of session in order to avoid what's known as a pocket veto. The Constitution grants the governor 10 days to veto or amend legislation, including after the session adjourns. So, if the legislature waits until the last day to pass important bills, she could veto them, and they'd have no recourse. With the 10-day window, they gain the ability to override any potential vetoes on that last day of session. It doesn't happen every year, but it does more often than not. Should the legislature choose that option, it would likely mean that Monday, June 19th, is the last day of the session. As it happens, that is the 105th day since the session began on March 7th. So in all likelihood, we are going the full length in session this year. Hope you can plan accordingly. The legislature's pace will be a key factor in what bills move and which don't down the stretch. In the House, Democrats have used their floor time and procedural tools to slow down the pace at which legislation flows, leading to some tense moments. The Senate typically moves through bills at a much speedier clip, but that fast pace became an issue last week as some senators complained that the legislation before the body wasn't being fully explained. Senate President Pro Tem Greg Reed said that the chamber will be much more deliberative down the stretch to avoid confusion.
One of my favorite words as a businessman and also as a legislator is intentional. And I think that word is been important to me because it just means you're recognizing the context of where you are and what you're doing and why you're doing it, and you have a very focused attitude of doing it correctly. And so we've had a couple of instances, as you all understand, we get moving fast in the session to where there's a lot of things happening. Many times we're going so quickly, we're trying to get our staffs from LSA and all of our support staffs to keep up with all the things we're doing. Minds are changing quickly. So I just feel like as we move on to the latter part of the session, we have been very intentional and very deliberate to this point in the body dealing with significant issues. We just need to make sure that we slow down, not for the sake of being slow, but just to make sure that things are explained appropriately. We've had a couple of senators on both the majority and the minority have made some requests of me to say, I'm trying to keep up, but I didn't really understand what we were doing there, and can we ask everybody to explain themselves a little bit better?
Ever since the Senate's passage of the $2.8 billion supplemental appropriations bill, there's been some grumbling about the Senate's changes to the bill, especially as it impacts projects in Central and South Alabama. In particular, the removal of a new specialty healthcare high school in Demopolis has been the subject of some criticism. House Speaker Nathaniel Ledbetter said the House is going to take a fresh look at that bill and see what changes its members want to make. He said he's part of a larger conversation about improving education in Alabama.
The day was Education Day, and as you've seen, we moved several pro-choice bills, and that's been a theme of what we've been trying to do, and we'll continue to look at those. And that's one of my top priorities is try to improve education in the state. That's why I set up an Education Day, and we'll continue down that line. The budgets will be. I think we're real close on them. I think Representative Garrett has worked extremely close with Senator Orr, and I think they're pretty much in agreement on everything. There'll be probably a few changes, but we'll see what those are and move forward. My preference on the Demopolis schools would be that we could do a feasibility study, and just see if there's a chance that it's going to be successful. And that's my biggest thing. I want to make sure if we're going to spend that kind of money, that we have appetite for the kids across the state that's willing to go there. And I think doing a feasibility study is a conservative thing to do.
For your planning purposes, the House convenes at 1 o'clock p.m. and the Senate comes in at 3 o'clock p.m. Coming up next, I'll sit down with Attorney General Steve Marshall to talk about National Police Week, his recent trip to the southern border, and other issues. We'll be right back.
You can watch past episodes of Capital Journal online at video.aptv.org. Capital Journal episodes are also available on APTV's free mobile app. You can also connect with Capital Journal and link to past episodes on Capital Journal's Facebook page. And you can listen to past episodes of Capital Journal when you're driving or on the go with Capital Journal podcasts. Keep up with what's happening with Capital Journal.
Joining me next is Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall. Mr. Marshall, thanks for coming on the show.
Always good to be back. Thank you.
Well, it's National Police Week, and as the state's top law enforcement officer, I wanted to have you on just to mark the occasion, but also just have a conversation about police and how it's going. But, it seems to me that they work pretty dangerous jobs, maybe even more dangerous than in years past. Is that your observation?
Yeah, I think clearly so. I mean, there's a couple of factors involved. Number one, if you look particularly in the last couple of years, it's some of the most violent periods we've seen as far as homicide rates, assaults, sexual offenses that we've seen in quite some time. And then also we have a diminished number of law enforcement in our communities. And I think both of those coming together make it very problematic. But the other thing that people still don't talk about enough is that during the pandemic, when obviously our healthcare workers were on the front line, so was law enforcement. And I think if you look at the numbers, it was an exponential increase in the number of law enforcement lives that were lost in the line of duty. Much of that was attributable to COVID-19.
We talk in the State House a lot about the mental health issue, and you and I have had these conversations as well with, they're just now starting to get back, the appropriate level of care for mental health. But one of the big pieces of conversation is that is also a big factor on law enforcement responding to a situation where if somebody's in crisis, that could lead to another dangerous factor.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you look at this year alone, in Shelby County, you had 2 sheriff's deputies responding to a welfare check, and both of them were shot as a result of what they did that day. It had nothing to do with an ongoing crime in that particular home, but somebody who obviously had their own struggles. Now, fortunately, both those deputies lived, but incredibly dangerous situation. It's why, to some extent, a lot of the defund the police argument that many advocates said, let's put a social worker in there to deal with some of these situations. These are very dangerous when law enforcement arrives. Their skill set, their expertise is obviously very essential, but they also are not designed to be healthcare workers. And unfortunately, I think sometimes we've seen in Alabama's history that too many times the criminal justice system becomes that vehicle to provide somebody with mental health care. That's not the way it ought to be designed, but yet at least pleased to know that in the areas of addiction and other areas of mental health disorders, at least the criminal justice system has been able to do referrals that's gotten somebody treatment and help.
Mm-hmm. Yep, they're talking about it this week actually, this whole 988 versus 911 situation, which is a big step, big conversation. I want to get to your border trip. I spoke with Senator Bell, spoke with Senator Reed, because they were on this trip with you down to the southern border. You also had district attorneys and everything, but these are Alabama officials going to the Mexican border. We're obviously not a border state, but what did you learn from the situation that applies to your work here?
Yeah, a couple of things. Number one, in my role as AG, it's the important work that me and several of my colleagues around the country are doing to fight the Biden administration around immigration policy. You saw recently, even at the end of Title 42 going away, that one of the actions was my colleague in the state of Florida, who was able to put a hold on what would have been the policy after Title 42 went away, is that in crowded ports of entry where the detention centers are already 3 times capacity. The design in the memo from the Biden administration was just to release those individuals and say, we'll send you a letter in the mail and tell you when your court date is. I mean, that's completely insane, inconsistent with the law. And so we've seen various victories. We've attacked the efforts to modify the parole system. You know, people talk about the app that's being used.
Yeah.
Well, right now we have people jumping on a plane in certain countries saying they have sponsors coming in and hopefully they're simply going to show up for their immigration hearing to determine their asylum claim. Again, far exceeding the authority that Congress gave them. So, number one, it is being able to talk to those border officials, and particularly those impacted directly in Texas from the public safety side, to know that many of those efforts that we have are helpful. And then beyond that is to figure out what we can do potentially in statute that could buttress and support what is already going on at the border itself. You know, we should be very grateful for Texas. I mean, 300,000+ contacts with those coming across illegally, taking immense measures with both money and with resources to be able to do the things otherwise we would hope Border Patrol would be able to do, but they're simply overmatched at the moment. But find vehicles under our law that's, number one, not preempted, but also can provide an effective deterrent here.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess it's frustrating to see the pictures. It's frustrating to see all the crowding at the border, throngs of people coming. You wonder about just the years and really decades of failed border policy, failed immigration policies. I think back to the Trump administration when we had Attorney General Jeff Sessions. They went tough, zero tolerance, and it kind of worked. It certainly seemed to slow down the influx, the magnet maybe, if you will. But you also had some pretty tough images that I think probably contributed to the president himself saying, okay, we're not going to go with this policy. So I guess my question is, do we have the stomach to do what it takes to actually enforce a border?
Well, I think we have to authorize those federal officials who have the responsibility to enforce the immigration laws to do it. And clearly that's not going on right now. I mean, the effort is really to make Border Patrol and Custom Enforcement paper processors more than the active enforcement wing that they have been historically. The other thing that I think was obvious from being down there is the Remain in Mexico policy had exceedingly high merit in being able to slow down those who are coming to be able to make those asylum claims. When we're now allowing people to come in the border and basically telling them you can't work while you're here, ultimately trusting them to show up at some immigration hearing at some point in time that could be up to 2 years down the road, there's no border control at that point in time. And so I do think we saw the House act late last week with a border security measure that made sense on a lot of fronts. We'll see whether or not this administration feels like that's something that they want to consider. I hear that's kind of dead on arrival already, but they can't point to the House and say they haven't acted. They've clearly put something out there that is based on much of what we heard while we were down on the border itself, and gives some tools to be able to try to stem the tide of what has obviously been an increasing number of people coming in. And also remember this, the ports of entry don't include anybody that is from Mexico. Those are going to be, all other countries are coming in that ports of entry. It is Mexican nationals that are crossing illegally. And that's really where Texas is taking on a huge load, and not only being able to secure some of those open areas, but also apprehending and then providing individuals they are able to detain back to Border Patrol to go back across the border.
Mm-hmm. It's a tough issue. It's politically fraught. Do you think there will ever be the political incentive on both sides? Because that seems to me that's the tough part, is Republicans and Democrats, with their different sets of political incentives, having enough to, okay, we got to figure this out because it's such a national problem.
I mean, I think clearly there needs to be the political will to deal with it, because what we've sort of handled on the litigation side really is a result of a divided Congress that hasn't acted. And so it's why you see the Obama administration, through a memo from the Department of Homeland Security, implement the DACA program, which ought to be incorporated in law if that's in fact going to be the policy of our country, not be a bureaucrat signing a memo to be able to do it. It's why much of what we've seen during the Biden administration has really been done by executive fiat as opposed to Congress acting. This is an area that Congress needs to weigh into. They need to decide what the policy is, and the executive branch needs to stay out of policy making and do the enforcement.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll continue to have this conversation, but I want to move on to other issues, especially those going on here in the legislative session. There's multiple bills dealing with crime. There's retail theft. I think you were involved in that. There's also this gang violence bill. It's a little bit more controversial. Has had some pushback. Have you been involved in this legislation, and can you kind of explain what the problem is y'all are trying to attack?
Yeah, we're spearheading the gang legislation. It's one that, number one, Alabama's in the minority of states that doesn't have a bill on the books that allows us to deal with gang violence. And it's really designed to do two things. Number one, it says if you're going to be a member of a gang, there's nothing outlawing being a part of a group. And by gang, we're not talking about the Bloods, the Crips, the MS-13, whatever, not these sort of national gangs. A gang is really 3 or more people coming together for bad reasons. And if you're going to be in a gang, and you're going to commit a crime that furthers the purpose of the gang, we think your punishment needs to be enhanced. Because I've heard the statements of Randall Woodfin in Birmingham and the police chief in Birmingham, talked to mayors around the state, and they speak to the driver of a lot of the violence that they're seeing is gang specific, is that individuals coming together for territory reasons, for other reasons, to be able to further the purpose of the gang that are committing these random acts of violence in many cases. So let's give law enforcement and prosecutors a tool to deal with that. But also, we're going to say that if you're going to be a part of a gang that's engaged in criminal activity and you use a gun to be able to do that, we want to make sure that you serve a certain minimum amount of time, whether it be just possessing that gun during the purpose of committing that offense, or if you brandish or use that gun, it's going to be a lengthened period of time. And that's really designed to do two things. Number one is to provide an effective punishment for somebody that's involved in that type of activity. But it's also designed to deter somebody, number one, from entering the gang to begin with. But also, if you're going to engage in those gang crimes, at least do it without a firearm. Hopefully we change some minds and convince people not to be a part of it. But we think this is a very important piece of legislation for us, particularly when you see continued and ongoing high rates of violent crime in our state.
There's no question. We see it here in Montgomery. It's a frustrating problem. So what happens is, let's just say this law is enacted, and then prosecutors go to work, and maybe the first couple of times that somebody gets picked up and these laws are put in place and actually utilized, does word get around that, our buddy's locked up with actually a stricter sentence, a longer sentence than it used to be?
Yeah, that's clearly the hope, is that we're sending that very direct message that if you're going to make the intentional decision to be a part of criminal activity of this type, that you're going to understand going in that the punishment itself is going to be more significant. It's one of the reasons why I believe the federal gun laws have been so effective when they created certain mandatory minimums for those who were not entitled to possess a firearm. It became an effective deterrent, and it also became an effective tool to be able to take violent people off the street. We saw that during the tenure in which you spoke about General Sessions just a minute ago. During his time, we had great collaboration with our federal U.S. attorneys and did some really good things. And this is an opportunity for us to create a similar mechanism here in Alabama, and I think have very similar results.
Mm-hmm. You were recently involved in the prosecution of a murder yourself.
Yeah.
Doesn't always happen that the Attorney General goes to a relatively local case, but this is a special case. This was this cold case from down in Ozark, right?
It was, yeah.
Talk about this, why you felt it necessary to personally get involved.
That's the world I come from. When people still ask me what I do for a living, I tell them I'm a prosecutor. That's just kind of how I'm wired. It's what I'm very passionate about. And when the lead prosecutor in that case was unable to proceed as a result of a bike wreck, I got a call from the DA's office and asked whether we would help, and volunteered to do it myself. Number one, I think Attorney General, I need to make sure that I send that message not only to the state but to my team that I'm going to be involved and be active in what we're doing also. But this was also a unique case where, for the first time that I'm aware, genealogy DNA became an investigative lead for us in being able to identify the individual that now has been convicted. But it was a great opportunity for two families to be able to get justice for their daughters who were taken far too young. They were 17 years old in 1999 when Tracy and JB were taken from us. And I'm proud to be able to say, as a result of what the jury did there in Dale County, that those families now have justice.
is it different to put the prosecutor's hat back on and sort of a different set of skills that you're used to using every day? I realize you come from the background.
Yeah, I mean, you got to go back and review those rules of evidence again, right? I mean, that was part of it. But, I mean, I really do think that when I sort of think of what skills I have, the talents at least that God gave me, the ability to be in that courtroom is really kind of where I was born to be in many respects. And so the opportunity to be able to work with a tremendous team, wasn't just me, you know, I had a great teammate from my office, Jimmy Thomas, as well as Emmett Massey, who works in the DA's office there in Dale County. You know, collectively, really pleased with what we were able to do. But I don't mind telling you, it was nice to be able to get back and do it. It had been 6 years since I tried a case, and it's not completely like riding a bike, but at the same time, I hope I did that community proud by the conviction that we were able to obtain.
We just got a little bit of time left, but I wanted to ask you about this issue of ESG. Again, we talked about this before, environmental, social, and governance. You testified before Congress that it's something that nationally the Congress should take up and really get into. But now there's a state bill. There's a bill in the state Senate from Senator Dan Roberts dealing with ESG. They had it in committee and kind of scaled it back a little bit because there were those concerns from the business community about basic, free speech rights, their ability to do whatever they want. Where do you think that issue is? Are you tracking this bill at all?
Yeah, clearly so. And look, ESG is a fundamentally important issue. Went to Congress last week, testified there. It's ultimately about allowing the market to be able to work, but also that we don't have a concentration of resources and wealth that dictates policy across our country. And the reality is the ESG movement is designed to do two things: create a global energy policy, as well as to create preferred societal values, neither of which are the role independently of asset managers. That's the role of Congress, and it's the role of our state legislators. We need to make sure that as a state that we're identifying those industries that are clearly targeted in this area, and then make sure that we can create state protections for them. It's a complex issue, and I grant you that, but it's one I think that's appropriate for state policymakers. But first, we got to make sure that we understand the issue well, and then we're targeting the work that we're doing by those affected industries in our state.
Yeah, and I guess that sort of is the question. It was a long hearing. They eventually advanced the bill. But yeah, you just heard these sort of two notions bumping up against each other with, the desire to prevent was clearly overreach in some of the private sector without also preventing, coming too far back the other way, overcorrecting with a law on the books that might affect corporations.
Yeah, because when people talk about the free market itself, free market is not when those with access to wealth, for example, the BlackRocks, the Vanguards, the State Streets of the world, with collectively more assets than the United States GDP, being able to dictate to corporations and other entities how it is that they'll operate and policies that they need to be able to implement. That's not the market working. That's concentrated group of individuals, very small in number, that are controlling the policies of many corporations in our state. And we need to make sure, again, that we're allowing the market to work. I mean, look at right now Bud Light. I mean, that's a great example of where the market's working, right? The public's response to that advertising campaign.
But it didn't take a law.
Didn't take a law to be able to do it. But yet we also know that as a result of these alliances, and there's roughly 11 of these alliances that have been created basically when the United States withdrew from the Paris Accord, that are now trying to dictate through the access to capital as well as their interest in the respective companies of which they have assets, being able to dictate policy that way, not a corporation itself making that independent decision. And also let's look at, there's a huge discussion about the energy transformation, about how it is that we generate power in this country. There's been two other sort of historic areas there that have been driven not by outside influences, but by technology and by the economics of the time. That's the market working, and that's another thing that I think we can look at.
Attorney General Steve Marshall, thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you very much.
We'll be right back.
You can watch past episodes of Capitol Journal online anytime at Alabama Public Television's website, aptv.org. Click on the Online Video tab on the main page. You can also connect with Capitol Journal and link to past episodes on Capitol Journal's Facebook page.
Known as the Brown Bomber, Lafayette's Joe Louis is considered one of the greatest heavyweight boxing champions of all time. Louis was among the first African Americans to achieve national hero status in a white-dominated society. His 1938 defeat of German boxer Max Schmeling was a vivid refutation of Nazi Germany's official policy of white superiority and was celebrated throughout the nation. Following his service in World War II, Louis went on to a career of 68 wins, 54 by knockout. He still holds the record for successfully defending his title more times than any other heavyweight boxer, and for his 27 championship bouts. Upon his death in 1981, President Ronald Reagan waived the requirements for burial at the Arlington National Cemetery so that Joe Louis could be buried with full military honors.
That's our show for tonight. Thanks for watching. We'll be back tomorrow night at 10:30 with more coverage of the Alabama Legislature right here on Alabama Public Television. For our Capitol Journal team, I'm Todd Stacy. We'll see you next time.